Hi guys, welcome to the channel Women in History. You can call me E. February is Black History Month in the United States, so this month is dedicated to Black women in history, after which I will return to doing a mix of women from different cultures. Any women I don't get to in the month of February, because there are a lot, will be covered at some point on this channel regardless, because there are a lot of women that deserve to be highlighted from all over the world, and especially Black women. Now, I did say February was going to be froze out for me, but to be perfectly honest, I usually keep my hair in a protective style. So I figured a good compromise would be this kinkier wig, and then I have my own hair out in the front. Any Black women interested in the wig, you can leave a comment and I'll tell you what brand and style it is. But other than that, let's get into our person today. So today's woman was a former slave, emancipated after the Civil War, who turned into an investigative journalist to expose the continued cruel treatment of African Americans after emancipation. And that person is Ida B. Wells. Now, disclaimer, before we begin, we're going to be covering some disturbing events and unfortunate parts of U.S. history. Discussion of these events may be triggering for some. My goal is mainly to report history, and sometimes it's not very flattering. That doesn't mean we should shy away from a topic. History is meant to be observed and learned from where applicable. Regardless of a person's color or origin, each man and woman must stand on the merit of their own actions, and we are all capable of making changes. So, with that being said, let's get into our video. Ida B. Wells-Barnett was born on Bowling Farm near Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862. Ida Wells was the first child of James Madison Wells and Elizabeth Lizzie Warrenton. Ida's father was born to an enslaved woman named Peggy and Peggy's white enslaver. Thus, he was also enslaved after his birth. Ida's mother, Lizzie, had been abducted and trafficked from another plantation. She was one of 10 children, and unfortunately, her attempts to later find her family after emancipation was not successful. Before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, both of Wells's parents were enslaved to Bowling, and thus Ida was also born enslaved. James Wells built much of the Bowling Gatewood house in which Bowling lived, and which has now become the Ida B. Wells-Barnett Museum. The Wells family lived in slave quarters behind the main house. After the Emancipation Proclamation, which was declared on January 1st, 1863, Ida's father, James, became a trustee of the newly established Shaw University, which now goes by Rust College, in Holly Springs. He founded a successful carpentry business in Holly Springs in 1867, and his wife Lizzie became known as a famous cook. Wells-Barnett's parents were hopeful for the future for African Americans and instilled the value of education into their children. Ida B. Wells, who was one of 8 children, enrolled in Shaw University, where she attended until 1880, dropping out after she passed her teaching exam. During the fall of 1878, Wells-Barnett's parents passed away in a yellow fever epidemic, including one of her brothers. At the age of 16, she became the primary caretaker for her remaining 6 siblings. To keep her younger siblings together as a family, she found work as a teacher in a rural Black elementary school outside Holly Springs. Later, Wells and her 2 youngest sisters moved to Memphis to live with an aunt, Fanny Butler, in 1883. She was hired in Woodstock by the Shelby County school system. On May 4, 1884, Wells-Barnett undertook her commute to Shelby County on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. She purchased a first-class ticket to sit in the ladies' car, where she was soon told by the conductor to relocate to the smoking car, where all African Americans had to sit. She refused. After being forcefully dragged out of the train, at which point she bit the conductor, Wells-Barnett noted that the white passengers stood on the seats so that they could get a good view, and continued applauding the conductor for his brave stand. Wells-Barnett retaliated by suing the Ohio Railway Company, which resulted in successfully receiving compensation for the harassment. However, the Tennessee State Supreme Court eventually reversed the decision, but the case itself reflected Wells-Barnett's early dedication for equity under the law. On an interesting note, Wells had originally hired a Black lawyer to represent her, but he was paid off by the railway company. She then hired a white lawyer who won her original case. While teaching in Memphis public schools from 1883 until 1891, Wells wrote articles for Black newspapers around the nation under the pen name Iola. In 1889, she became part owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. 2 years later, the school board did not renew her contract after she wrote editorials critical of the conditions in the Black schools of the region. Elected secretary of the Black-run National Press Association in 1887, Wells became known as the Princess of the Press by her mostly male editorial colleagues. Wells-Barnett's writing took a turn in 1892 when her close friend Thomas Moss was lynched. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart had opened the People's Grocery Store in a South Memphis neighborhood. Moss's store did well and competed with a white-owned grocery store across the street, Barrett's Grocery, owned by William Russell Barrett. One day, 2 youths, an African-American boy and a Caucasian boy, were playing together in front of the People's Grocery. They got into a fight. The Caucasian boy's father went over to attack the African-American boy after seeing his son was losing the fight, at which point the workers of the People's Grocery, William Stewart and Calvin McDowell, intervened to stop the grown man from beating the little boy. The white grocer, Barrett, returned the next day to the People's Grocery with a Shelby County Sheriff's deputy, looking for William Stewart. Calvin McDowell, who greeted Barrett, indicated that Stewart was not present, but Barrett was dissatisfied with the response and was frustrated that the People's Grocery was competing with his store. Angry about the previous day's melee, Barrett responded that blacks were thieves and hit McDowell with a pistol. McDowell wrestled the gun away and fired at Barrett, missing narrowly. McDowell was later arrested but subsequently released. 2 days later, a group of 6 white men, including a sheriff's deputy, took electric streetcars to the People's Grocery. But they were met with a barrage of bullets coming from the People's Grocery. Hundreds of white men were then deputized almost immediately to put down what was perceived by the local Memphis newspapers as an armed rebellion by black men in Memphis. Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were arrested as co-conspirators and jailed pending trial. However, before the trial, around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of March 9, 1892, 75 men wearing black masks took Moss, McDowell, and Stewart from their jail cells at the Shelby County Jail to a Chesapeake and Ohio rail yard 1 mile north of the city and shot them dead. Ida, who was very close to Moss and was even godmother to one of his children, took the news and injustice very hard. Wells wrote in Free Speech and Headlight, urging blacks to leave Memphis altogether. There is therefore only one thing left to do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but take us out and murder us in cold blood when accused by white persons. This horrific event steered a new focus for Ida Wells's activist writing: lynchings. Lynching, as defined by Britannica, is a form of violence in which a mob, under the pretext of administering justice without trial, executes a presumed offender, often after inflicting torture and corporal mutilation. Hanging was a popular lynching method in southern U.S., but in effect, lynching is any public execution without due process, no matter the method. There were lots of reasons people made up to instigate and justify a lynching. Economic competition was one, like the case of Thomas Moss and others. Interracial dating or special experiences was another. Once Ida Wells-Barnett started investigating lynchings, she contended that many R-word charges arose from the discovery of voluntary sexual liaisons between white women and black men. The premise that had been going around was that lynching was necessary to prevent R-worders. Wells reported on her findings of the lynching of Thomas Moss and his friends and challenged the idea that lynchings were necessary in articles published in her co-owned newspaper, Free Speech. In response to Wells-Barnett, the Free Speech office was set on fire by a mob while she was away from the office. This caused Wells-Barnett to flee Memphis in fear for her safety, but it did not stop her from seeking to expose the lynchings going on in the South. Wells settled in New York, and lynching became her topic of research. She began writing for T. Thomas Fortune's New York Age. In June 1892, the paper published a lengthy attack on lynching, reprinted as Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in all its phases. In it, Wells argued that lynching was often used to counteract Black achievement and had grown worse as African Americans became more educated and successful. She also discussed the ways in which lynching mobs were formed and the common excuses that white officials used to justify the lynching of Black men. Wells-Barnett continued to report and expose treatment of African Americans during segregation that garnered national and worldwide attention. After African American women in New York gave Wells a testimonial dinner that raised about $400 for her crusade, she received dozens of lecture requests. On one visit to Philadelphia, she met Catherine Impey, an English woman who published the journal Anti-Caste. Early in 1893, Impey joined with Scottish author Isabel Mayo to invite Wells to tour Scotland and England in the cause of anti-lynching. Following her first lecture, the women organized the Society for the Recognition of the Brotherhood of Mankind, which invited Wells back the next year for a second tour. At the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago during 1893, she joined with the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass and Chicago lawyer Ferdinand L. Barnett to circulate a co-authored protest pamphlet. Even after Wells married Barnett in 1895, she continued her activism. She traveled with her nursing baby, supported in her endeavors by her husband and the Women's State Central Committee, who employed a nurse for Wells-Barnett when she traveled to give lectures on their behalf. Assuming the editorship of her husband's newspaper, the Chicago Conservator, Wells-Barnett remained a militant voice, giving speeches, investigating lynchings, criticizing Booker T. Washington, starting organizations, and joining movements while giving birth to 4 children. She also participated in the founding of such organizations as the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, the Afro-American Council in 1898, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1910, although she remained active in few of them. She personally founded the Ida B. Wells Women's Club in 1893, the Negro Fellowship League, a kind of settlement house for Black men, in 1910, and the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913. In addition, from 1913 to 1916, Wells-Barnett served as an adult probation officer in Chicago. She was active in the Republican Party and, in the 3 years before her death, began her autobiography and ran for the state Senate. She and William Monroe Trotter presented concerns over segregation to President Woodrow Wilson in 1915. At this meeting, she commented to President Wilson that there were more things going on in the government than he had dreamed of in his philosophy, and we thought it our duty to bring to his attention that phase of it which directly concerned us. Later in 1918, Wells-Barnett brought to attention the discriminatory treatment African American soldiers faced during and after World War I. Wells-Barnett's journalism and activism spent years encouraging public awareness on lynching and true equality in the law for African Americans in the American South and the rest of the United States. What I've covered here is just a comprehensive look at her activism, and there are many more details to learn about this woman and her life. She spoke out loudly and frequently in a time that was physically dangerous for her to do so. in order to hold true to her beliefs and justice, which makes me honored to present her here on Women in History.